So let me go ahead and hit record and welcome Dale Halaway. And Dale, with that introduction, perhaps you'd like to say a few opening words, and then I'll fire a few questions at you, and then we'll start to open this up and see who else on the line has some questions and would like to get your insight on their life situation.
Sounds great, Jesse. First of all, can you hear me clearly? I've been having a little challenge hearing you as you've been doing the introduction there. It kind of went in and out. So let's just make sure that everybody can hear me clearly.
Yep.
If we could.
Yeah, I've got confirmation that we can hear you, and I'll do my best to, if you could see what I'm doing right now to get your voice on the line, you might laugh. But I've got this set up in place, and I hope that I'll make sure to speak so that you can hear me, and everybody on the line is able to hear you as well.
Terrific. Well, let me start by saying thank you so much for the introduction, Jesse. I so have enjoyed, as I've said a few times before, this call, how much I've come to appreciate you and all that you do, but more specifically, just our relationship and how it just continuously deepens. And I know you would agree with this. It seems to also continue to further enrich both of us just as a result of our working relationship and now a dear friendship that has been cultivated over these last few years too. So I'm very appreciative of that, and thanks again so much. And to all of the listeners, thank you for joining us here this morning. As Jesse mentioned, I do have quite an interesting background. I think he used the word extensive experience, and that is true. I was born, if my mother was on the call here right now, which she's not, she's no longer even with us anymore, but if she was on the call, she would quickly jump in and say, that her son was born a very wise, or as a very wise soul. I was doing things in the earlier part of this life that at least no one in her circle of friends and family that had ever seen before. And so I quickly got that nickname, Mr. Wise kind of thing, early in this life. And then from there all the way through to now, I've also been someone who has never been afraid to kind of get into the ditch and do the work, whatever the work is in front of me. As Jesse had mentioned, I do have a fair amount of business experience or high-level business acumen as well, part of which I was born in this life with. Another part has been just from a lot of experiences in this particular life, having worked with this, thousands of entrepreneurs, a lot of CEOs with, fairly large companies, and helping them to go to wherever their next level is in terms of evolving themselves as an entrepreneur or a CEO or business owner. Beyond that, I've done just a tremendous amount of public seminars, coaching programs for the general public for actually now just over 4 decades. So I've been at this for a while. I've drawn just a tremendous amount of experience because I've been in so many situations that for me was fairly natural for me just to embrace and step into, unlike maybe others that I've seen along the way that seem to struggle with this. They're in a lot of resistance towards doing the very thing that they really are to be doing, or better yet, I'm sure we can all relate to what I'm about to say here next, that what happens with some people, they get really excited about doing something. They know that's exactly what they're to be doing, and they'll be among a few friends or colleagues, and they'll acknowledge out loud of what it is they're going to do, and they're so excited. And then you check in with them a couple weeks later, and they haven't even begun. And in some cases have dropped whatever it was that they said they were going to do, that they were so excited about doing, that was right for them to do. They just have a difficult time getting out of the chute, so to speak, and getting to that first base in that creative process of manifesting whatever it is that they said they really wanted to manifest in their day-to-day world. And so with me, it's been the opposite. It's one of the things I think I was also born with, that, once I said I was going to do something, you can pretty much go to the bank on it that I would go ahead and do that. Doesn't mean to say it was easy, and doesn't mean to say it was comfortable, and doesn't mean to say a lot of those times that I felt really secure within myself about doing those things. I just seemed to be kind of like fearless, so to speak. Not that I haven't had my own fear to transform throughout the years, but clearly when it came to this, I showed up. I mean, my dearest friends would often say, gosh, Dale is just so fearless, meaning that no matter what it was, and once I said I was going to do it, no matter how scared I was, I would just jump in and do it. And so I've noticed that throughout the years of working with many people, that this seems to be something that for most, meaning more than 50% of the people, at least that I've worked with, seems to be a big challenge. They get snafu'd on this idea of something's holding them back. Something's holding them back from stepping into, from truly embracing whatever it is that they really are to be stepping into or embracing. And so around that, this was a few years back, I decided I was going to start writing some books. And I started with a trilogy, or a series of 3 different books. The first one being called To Change, the one that Jesse referred to in the intro. And that was really the impetus. I wanted to start off my trilogy with a book that really addresses this dynamic of change. And more specifically, why is it that so many people resist the change that's literally knocking on their door, where perhaps their soul has entered into their physical life somehow, some way, and is knocking on their doorstep or staying in their doorstep, prompting them to make this change. Another way of saying the same thing, prompting them to stand into something, to step into something that more than likely is going to scare them, activate them, frighten them even a little bit, cause them to feel really uncomfortable. But what is it? Why do so many people seem to resist this thing we call change? So I ended up investing a lot of my creative energy on not just studying this or discovering the truths that I discovered along the pathway, not just with myself personally, but with those that I've worked with professionally, but then eventually got to the point where I was able to put a lot of this down and turn it into a book, that now the book can be used as, if you will, as a tool to assist in this area of helping us to better understand this dynamic of change. And more importantly, why is it that we resist it so much? And then to take it a step further, how could we let go of that resistance and really replace it with actually embracing in the most welcoming of ways, so that whatever that is that we now step into, that now begins to change us in a way that puts us on a path towards manifesting our greater potential here in this life experience.
Very good. So thank you for that, for sharing that, Dale. And, I'm curious, when it comes to this concept of change and people, even knowing and feeling so strongly that they want to or should or are being called forth into a new area of life, a new phase of a relationship or a career, what is it that, in your experience, comes up that prevents people from actually seeing that through? Maybe you could speak to some of the common inhibitors of change, or some of the things that come up for people that short circuit what they actually know and feel and intuit to be the right next steps in really any area of their life. Or feel free to tune into a few specifics that you've seen come up time and again.
Well, one of my dissertations that I always impart in any seminar that I do, and as you know, Jesse, I do a lot of different types of seminars, meaning under completely different titles and themes and so on. And one of the common denominators of my seminars is I'm always bringing in some aspect of that dissertation around the ego versus the soul self. And I do that in the book, and in book number 1, I'll do it again in book number 2. Now, every time I do it, I approach it from a very different angle, because the ego has a lot of complexity to it. And depending on how strong the person's ego is, determines how complex the ego has become. So one of the things that we know, or that I've realized throughout the years of doing this, is that the ego, when it's given its will to direct us in whatever way it wants to direct us, it'll always take us to a place of status quo, or holding the position of status quo. And the reason for that is the ego in of itself is not bad, it's not good, it just is. But with it in its is state, what it does, it's always geared to protect itself. In fact, it never stops not protecting itself. And one of the things that it protects itself from is forward movement, because of what a forward movement implies. If we're going to move forward with our life, personally, professionally, spiritually, financially, relationally, emotionally, on whatever level of our existence, the moment we begin that process of moving forward, the ego activates. And when it activates because forward movement implies a risk that the ego is going to lose something, or it's going to lose its control that it has over us in our world, all designed to keep us safe. But as I often say, safe from what? And so what happens when people don't understand the complexity of the ego, or at least in this particular aspect, they easily get tricked by the ego to the point of where they don't even know where this is coming from. They don't know that they're under the influence of their ego. Everybody has an ego until you no longer have one. And to no longer have one would mean you'd be in the presence of somebody who's done a tremendous amount of self-transcendence work. Because ultimately, when you've done enough healing or enough transformational work, the ego transcends into the soul. There's an integration that occurs to where the ego and the soul are no longer separate from each other. But until that gets healed, there's always this separation. There's this wall or wedge of division between the ego and the soul, and that's why masters who have gone before us have often referred to this as the greatest battle that you and I will ever enter into, is the battle that goes on within us individually. And this battle is between the ego and the soul. Will the individual become wise enough, aware enough, awake enough to be able to recognize when it is they are under the influence of their ego? Their ego is influencing their choices. So now coming back to this exercise of recognizing that there's something that we're really to be embracing. There's something we're really to be doing in our life. Whatever that is, that represents forward movement. It always does. It's the forward movement. As soon as the ego picks up on the energy of that forward movement, the ego starts its influence, which once again is to stop us from moving forward. It's stopping us from moving forward, not because it's punishing us, not because it's cursing us. The ego in of itself believes that's its role. It believes that it needs to stop this as a way to make sure we stay safe. But again, safe from what? Well, now we go to the next piece. And the next piece has to do with the individual set of issues, patterning, belief system. That all produces this structure, energetic structure that the ego resides in and rules over. And so if the person has, I don't know, we'll just say 2 or 3 beliefs within this energetic structure that's of a true limiting nature, or they have 3 lower energy patterns, whatever those lower energy patterns are, or they have a couple of core issues within their structure that I highlight in the book being called The Change, as in the 7 common core issues that we as humanity share. Now, it doesn't mean to say you have all 7, but as I make the point in the book, that guaranteed, at least with all the thousands of people that I've worked with over the years, everybody has at least one of those 7 core issues. In fact, most people have not only a core issue, they also have a secondary issue, meaning most people have at least 2 of these deep-seated issues that the ego is using to influence the individual at the level of choosing. So now, for example, you know you're to be stepping into something. You know you're to be changing something. You know you're to be doing something new. And yet, we don't do it. We don't do it because we are under the influence of this ego. And again, this is not about making the ego wrong or right for that matter. But we are under the influence of the ego, and you can always tell, you know, as a coach. I mean, I've coached literally, I don't know how many people, 1,000 or more people over the years, individually. And so I don't know how many coaching sessions I've done over the 40 years that I've been doing this for anymore. But what I do know is that when the ego starts to trick or starts to influence the individual, what I now know beyond a shadow of a doubt, I can spot it from a mile away with anybody that I'm working with, whether it's one of my students in the seminars or one, you know, an individual or their company or their family or relationship that I'm personally coaching. I can spot it. In fact, you know, a lot of times the people that I work with will often comment on it, like, how does he know this about me and so quickly before I even can catch it? Well, it's because I've been doing it for so long and I've done it for so many people, and of course I've done my own inner work. So what happens here is the ego slips in, and next thing you know, it begins this process of influencing us at the level of our choice making. So even though last week I chose to announce to my friends or my business associates on what it was that I was going to do, and in that moment I was so excited, I was so sincere. All of that could be true, and yet in this week, all of a sudden, I'm coming up with all kinds of reasons why I can't do that. I'm starting to behave in a way, that's those lower energy patterns that the ego is now using to activate a lower energy pattern to get us to behave in a certain way that moves us away from that forward movement, stepping in. Well, if we don't understand this, if we don't know how to trace this, if we don't know how to track this, well, then, needless to say, the individual constantly remains under this influence to the point where sometimes I'll have people come into my classes for the first time, and you know, they're now 40 years of age, and they are so frustrated with life. I mean, in some cases, they're almost willing to give up on life because of this thing that's gone on for years now, only they don't know what it is that's been going on. They don't know what it is around this influence that they've been under that's been causing them to choose in the way that they've been choosing. And as always, you know, come the end of the day, we get more of what it is we've been actually choosing. So if I'm choosing to engage in my lower energy patterns, if I'm choosing to remain under the influence of my limiting beliefs, all under the influence of this ego, and if I'm unconscious toward that, it doesn't matter. If that's what my choices are, then those choices must be followed by a consequence or a blessing. They must be followed by an effect. For every choice we make, it has its own corresponding effect. If I'm choosing under the influence of the ego, I will experience a set of effects that will be very different, or a set of results. It'll be very different than that if I'm truly under the influence of my soul. If I'm under the influence of my soul, and I'm choosing from that place, I will experience my life differently. And so now, you know, we have people on the planet, most of which are still under the influence of the ego, some of which are truly under the influence of their soul, and you can see it. You can see it because, you know, the results never lie, right? At least that's one of my teachings. The results never, ever lie. And I'm very good at translating someone's results, very skilled, meaning I can go into somebody's life in a relatively short period of time by just studying the results that are manifesting in their day-to-day world. I can give them a library of information about themselves and their deepest inner psyche on what's really occurring, of which they often refer to me as God. Are you so psychic? And yes, I do have psychic abilities, but a lot of times I'm not even using my psychic abilities at that point. I'm just being really practical because over the years, I learned how to break all of this down. And of course, as a teacher, now I teach people how to break it down in their life so that they can better see it. Because also, come the end of the day, if you can't see it, you're not going to change it. If you can't see how your ego is influencing you, then you're not going to change it. The only way we can even have a chance to change this influence that we've been under from that of the ego to the soul, we first and foremost, we've got to be able to see it, because, we are responsible for what comes out of us. We are responsible from around what flows through us. We are responsible for our own manifested outcomes that all come from us. And because we are responsible for that, we've been given that responsibility. We signed up for that responsibility as a soul self. And so because of that, nothing can really change. This relationship to the ego cannot change until we are able to actually see it in motion. Once we see it in motion, and we have the right body of teachings that we can access to help re-navigate or better navigate through that process of basically taking the power back from the ego and moving the power back to where it properly belongs, which is with the soul self. And in that, obviously, is an aspect of self-mastery, and why, very few people up until most recently have been able to achieve this place, because, again, there is a complexity here, and we live in a world that, for the most part, hasn't really educated us, up until most recently, hasn't really educated us on how to actually do this.
Indeed. And it is perhaps a more recent development that terms like the soul and living and embodying your soul are becoming, I wouldn't necessarily mainstream, but more commonly held and perhaps more popular beliefs. One of the things that you really focus on in the book, Dale, and one of the things that I've really learned from you is that answering the call to change and moving forward in life and realizing one's destiny isn't necessarily so much about doing more as it is about letting go. And indeed, the subtitle of being called to change, let go of all that no longer serves you and grow into your full potential, is highlighted right there. Is there something you'd like to speak to in terms of letting go and how to ease the process of letting go of that which no longer serves that would be helpful for everybody on the line? And as you get ready to speak to that, for everybody that is on the line, go ahead and think of any questions you may have for Dale and put them into the chat, and let me know if this is useful and interesting and helpful to you so far.
Yeah, very good. Well, first of all, letting go, at least in my experience over the years, what I've noticed is this just challenges, everyone to some degree. I remember years ago, I didn't know how to let go. And back in the days when I did not know how to let go, because again, it's not like there's a university on the planet that teaches people how to let go. At least when I grew up, there sure didn't have one. The only way you could access some of these teachings is you had to go into what was known as underground, the secret mystery schools that were not advertised. There was no marketing around them. The only way you got into them is you had to be referred into them to even access these higher level of teachings. And so for me as a young man, not only was I not letting go of that of which was no longer serving me, I was actually getting snafu'd on that of which I was hanging on to that I really was to be letting go of. So, and once you start doing this, it begins to create a set of problems, like problems you never even had. In fact, what I've noticed is when somebody has not yet learned how to do this, or has not yet developed the skill set, the inner, and there is an inner skill set that one needs to develop in order to get really good at letting go. Because in order for me to let go of something that's no longer working in my life, I first got to be able to identify it. If I can't identify it, again, going back to what I said earlier, if I can't see what it is I'm to be letting go of, then, I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? I'm not going to let go of it. And the next piece that becomes really obvious is, do I have a process? Do I really know how to let go? Do I have the skill set inside of me that I've taken the time to develop like a muscle? Have I done that level of work yet, so that once I recognize what it is I'm ready to be letting go of, I now am skilled to actually be able to let go of that? Well, here's what happens is, if I have not done this yet, if I don't know how to let go, or maybe I do know what to let go of, but I'm constantly struggling in letting go. Sometimes we'll see this in relationships, right? Where, two people have come together, they've been together for a couple of years, the relationship is morphed into a more toxic relationship. The relationship is now kind of beating up on each other, maybe not physically, but emotionally, mentally, verbally. It's lowering each other's self-esteem or decreasing each other's inner self-confidence. I'm sure everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. You probably have at least one friend or a family member where you've seen, literally, they start one way at the beginning part of the relationship, and 3 years later, they become different. Not in a positive way. They become different in a more, if you will, negative way. And where they become weaker. They're not themselves anymore, or perhaps better yet, maybe they're in the process of now losing themselves in the context of that relationship that's clearly not working. And it's not going to work. If we're in a relationship for 3 or 4 years and the relationship is still not working, the odds are it's probably not going to work, because there's something else in the context of coming together in that relationship that was missed, as in a golden truth or a golden nugget, and so on. Another conversation perhaps for another time on that. I'm using this, of course, as an example. So say this person's now in this 3 or 4 year long relationship, and even, maybe they're still wrestling with the idea that, this is something that I should be letting go of, or this is something that I should hang on to even tighter, right? They're in that experience of, they really don't know. They're scared to let it go because of what it implies, but they don't know if they should keep on hanging on to it because of what it also implies in light of who they are becoming in that process, meaning their self-confidence is getting weaker, their self-esteem is lowering, and so on. And so there they are, and they're not able to identify it. Or you might have the person who can identify it, who clearly recognizes, no, this relationship is expired, this relationship is over, but they can't let it go. Or at least that's what they say. They can't let it go. So they hang on, they go for another year. And then that next year creates all kinds of extra consequences, or what I refer to in the book as, unnecessary pain. So in the book, I talk about pain and how significant pain is in our life. But I narrow it down to, there are 2 types of pain. And one of them is completely unnecessary. The other one is necessary. But again, a lot of people perhaps don't understand what pain is, meaning the necessary pain, and how to really work with it, and how to really embrace that in your life, let alone people who can even see themselves when they're in process of creating the unnecessary pain. So in this case, if we're not identifying what it is we're to be letting go of, that's no longer serving us or no longer working in our lives, then what's happening now, we're not only not dealing with our original pain, we're now in process of creating the unnecessary pain. This is what causes our lives to become more complex, personally, professionally, spiritually, financially, because now we're in a process where we're actually creating more of its like, when in fact we really don't need to be doing that. What's happening is we either, number one, cannot identify what it is we're really to be letting go of, or maybe we do identify what it is we're to be letting go of, but we haven't developed these skills yet inside of ourselves. So therefore, we're snafu. We're literally stuck. We're snagged on this process where we can see that we're to be letting go of that, but the bottom line is we're not letting go. And if we're not letting go, this is now causing a whole other problem to come into manifestation. As that next problem comes into manifestation, as in the unnecessary problem in this context, This is what now creates the situation. It takes the situation to a new level of complexity. And so as this occurs, what that ultimately does, it blocks us from our soul self, which means the soul, as I'm sure we all know, the soul is what holds our potential. In our soul's DNA resides our highest and our greatest potential. But it's important to understand that that potential must be released. Next question, how does it release? What do we need to do to help it to release into existence? Well, one of the most important things that we need to do is learn how to let go. In our society, we've been conditioned to literally not let go. We've been conditioned that once we find something, whether it works or not, it doesn't matter. We've been conditioned to hang on to it. Hang on to it, hook into it, never let it go. And that is just not a super healthy way to live our existence. What's a healthy way to live our existence is to understand the truth, the higher and greater truth here, that life is all about letting go. Life and death are connected. You cannot have one without the other. That is a truth. And yet most people are terrified of the death. Well, that's what letting go is. Letting go is a transformational death. It's an energetic death. Again, someone who's been misunderstanding this process, this sacred process of life and death. In order for me to grow into my full potential, I have that divine birthright, just as everyone has that divine birthright. Doesn't mean to say I'm going to do it. Doesn't mean to say I'm going to actually grow into my full potential. In fact, most people, up until at least now, have not been growing into their full potential. They're doing the complete opposite because they haven't yet learned how to truly let go of that of which is no longer working, or another way of saying the same thing, that of which is to be dying, as in that transformational death, that energetic death. And because they are misunderstanding that, they're not embracing that process. If they're not embracing that process, that death process that is, that letting go process that is, if they're not embracing it, then they're doing the complete opposite, which is resisting it. But what happens when you resist it, whether you're aware of it or not, you might be very unconscious towards your resistance, for example. When we're resisting it, all of that does, there's an actual law. When I was a young man, I got turned on to universal law, and I couldn't get enough of it. And I started studying it. And I spent 10 years of my professional life going out to different cities and teaching people on universal law. And, that was many years ago. And since I've integrated all of that into my higher teachings that I now share with people. But one of the laws is the law of opposition. It's actually considered the hidden law within the universe. And what it says is that of which I oppose strengthens. And so if I'm resisting whatever it is that I'm resisting, that actually strengthens. So if I'm resisting the letting go in my life, what then strengthens is the struggle. It's the struggle that ends up getting stronger. So, we have people, and I'm sure everybody can relate to this, especially those of you that are coaches or teachers possibly on this call. You're working with somebody, and they keep on talking about, gosh, why is it so hard? Why does it have to be so much struggle? Well, bingo. It's because they've developed a pattern that's in alignment with this law that they're currently unconscious towards, where they are opposing the very thing that they're to be embracing, which means they're resisting the very thing that they're to be embracing, only they don't know this. In all fairness to them, they've gone unconscious. It's an unconscious move. But come the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether we're conscious or unconscious, quite frankly, when it comes to this. If that's what I'm doing unconsciously, then by universal law, it must follow suit. It must come into manifestation that way, whether I'm conscious of it or not. That's why it's so important, especially in this new era that we've now entered into. This is all about not just waking ourselves up or being woken up, But more specifically, this is also about learning how to live our life authentically, which means we've got to start connecting to what's really going on inside of us and be willing to stand up to this, be willing to confront this in a way that's conscious, in a way that's responsible and mature, hopefully. But this is what we've got to be doing. We've got to be doing a lot of it. As we do this, that's what all of a sudden now we start to shift our own energy flow, so that our energy, we all know that we are beings of energy, but what we might not know is our part in how we direct that energy. Because if I'm directing that energy in a negative way, even if I'm not aware of it, then I'm going to get a negative response. If I'm directing that energy in a positive, higher way, then I'm going to get a response that's in alignment with that, that's equal to that. That's the way it's been set up.
Very good. Thank you, Dale. And, you mentioned something to the effect of, in this era or in this time, in this new emerging time that we're in, maybe you could speak to, from your perspective, what is different or changing that's different from any time in the past, perhaps, and how people can most easily or with the most grace live authentically within themselves and in alignment with the emerging energy that is present and unfolding at this time in history.
Well, as I said, I think everybody can resonate with this at this juncture, that, we are in this process that began a few years back of awakening. But what does that mean? So, we're, in order to wake up to the larger version of me, I've got to be able to go through the lower version of me. In fact, that is the way to literally traverse through all lower parts of ourselves. And which is, in our society, we've been conditioned, as in the collective conditioning, we've been conditioned to literally stay away from this, to not go there. And one of the ways in how we've been conditioned is through, numbing ourselves out. We become a very drug-oriented society, right? Anytime we get a painful sensation in our body, anytime we get any kind of a pain, we've literally been conditioned to go to the bottle of Tylenol or go to our favorite drug of choice. And it could be food, could be alcohol, could be whatever. Everybody gets the idea, I'm sure. And so, but that's that's a collective conditioning. And kind of like in the movie The Matrix. So what happens is, in the collective, it was designed a long time ago to, quite frankly, keep the citizens here on the planet asleep, to keep them unconscious, but have them believe that they were actually conscious. And this has been going on for thousands of years, until most recently, when this awakening from spirit, from that of a higher place, if you will, started to come upon us here in this dimension. And so as that started to happen, then, more and more people could see that, no, there's some kind of an awakening going on. There's some kind of a lift happening. There's some kind of a transformation that's occurring. And not that everybody completely understands it just yet, but clearly they can see something else is happening that's different than that of what was happening on the planet, 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, and so on. But that's just the starting point. Then we go from there in this most recent sub-new area that we just stepped into, which is all about living authentically, which really means bringing ourselves back into alignment with our most true self, our authentic self. In order to do that, we've got to do that uncomfortable work. In other words, it's not just as simple as, we go to sleep one night and roll out of bed the following morning, and all of a sudden we're fully awake, and we're now the embodiment of our highest self, our greatest self. It doesn't work that way. It never has worked that way. The way it works, and the way it has always worked, which is now coming forward more than ever before in this new era, because we have beings, these courageous beings who have gone ahead and really done this deeper work. They've traversed into the depths of their psyche, where it's been the darkest, where the most shadow aspects have been residing. And they've been dealing with this. They've been confronting this and bringing it forward to clear it, and then ultimately realign themselves, getting themselves closer and closer to their true self, the highest or greatest version of themselves, in which they begin that process of embodying. So in order to do that in this era that we're in right now, it requires us to be able to go in and start uncovering the unpleasant truths in our lives. This is such a huge piece. I've been on this now for a few years, and those that I work with or that I serve and assist, I have seen some remarkable changes take place in their lives. But more specifically, they're returning back to their state of wholeness. They're literally returning back to this place of where they are in perfect alignment with their authentic self. Now, if they were on the call right now and you were to ask them, well, was that easy? They would all say, not at all. In fact, many times they were tempted to abandon this path and to go back to what they already knew, whatever that was, to keep themselves nice and safe. But those who continued, they're now experiencing their authentic self in a way like they've never done before. And it has brought upon some really wonderful, beautiful changes into the way that they experience their life day to day now. But this has to do with because they were willing to learn how to call up and ultimately confront an unpleasant truth in their life. So here's what I've noticed. First of all, this idea of unpleasant truths. So within our field of consciousness, we have unpleasant truths. We also have pleasant truths. We could also call them, we have lower energy truths and we have higher energy truths. Well, the energy truths we're going to need if we're ultimately going to embody our soul in this life. But in order to get to those higher energy truths and actually embody them, we've got to deal with their lower octave. Every higher energy truth that we carry within our soul self, there's a lower energy truth. There's an unpleasant truth also sitting within our field of consciousness somewhere. And until that unpleasant truth is correctly dealt with, we maybe can access from time to time on an intellectual level, on a conceptual level, that higher energy truth. The problem is we cannot embody it. And the reason why we cannot embody it, because the lower energy truth that is its direct opposite. Here's another law, the law of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. So what happens is if we're not dealing with the lower rung always has the power and the potential to pull us back to itself. So we could be, for example, in a seminar, and the seminar is really designed to elevate us, to inspire us, to stimulate us. So we rise to a higher height than we've been before. But then we come out of the seminar, we're not able to hold it for all that long, partly because whatever that seminar has helped us rise up to, whatever that is, it's got its polar opposite. Now, if you've cleared out, if you really have transformed, if you really have let go of its polar opposite, then you're out of the woods. You're on your way. But if you have not cleared out your polar opposite, then it's a question of time. You will get sucked back down to that lower polar opposite like a vacuum. You can't stop it from not happening, even though I know there's some people who believe they can. And then a few days later, all of a sudden, they're back in it again because of this lower energy that's residing within our own consciousness that we haven't yet fully confronted or completely cleared out or realigned. So when I go in and I deal with an unpleasant truth that's been sitting in my field for, we'll say, maybe years, when I deal with that properly, that's what allows me not only now to access its polar opposite, as in the higher truth, but more specifically, it now empowers me to be able to embody that higher truth. What I've noticed and what I work with when it comes to soul embodiment is, I have a soul embodiment process that I've created throughout the years. And in this process, this is at its core. This is it, is we've got to be able to identify these unpleasant truths at whatever pace that we can handle. So obviously you're not going to go in there and identify 5 of them all at once. It'll blow out your nervous system. That's not cool. But you can go in there and maybe identify 1 of them. And then comes the work. You don't just identify it and all of a sudden let it go, especially if you've got an unpleasant truth that's been in there for months or better yet, even years or decades. It's not that fast. It takes time, because every time we go in and I identify something of an unpleasant nature in my life that's been kind of running my life or influencing my life, under the influence again of the ego, because the ego is going to use this material. It's going to use these unpleasant truths, quite frankly, to continue its influence of the choices it wants us to make. And so what happens when I go in, or I take somebody in to help them to identify an unpleasant truth, once that unpleasant truth is identified and they really are willing to stand up to it, and sometimes they are, and sometimes it takes them a few more weeks or even a few more months to actually get ready to stand up to it. It just is what it is. But once they are willing and ready to actually stand up to it, that's when the real work begins. And sometimes some of these unpleasant truths, at least from my experience, they can take weeks or even months to completely clear, depending on the depth of the unpleasant truth. But here's the really awesome thing about all this, and that is, once you clear out an unpleasant truth, within seconds, it's direct opposite, it's polar opposite from your higher self or your soul self comes into existence in that of your own body temple, like that quick. And in fact, I've had my own experiences with this throughout the years, but I've had some of my students who will say to me that they'll like literally hear with their physical ear. It's actually their inner ear. They think it's their physical ear. But they hear a click, as in something clicks into place. Once they get to this point where one of those unpleasant truths is totally cleared, and in a split second, the higher truth comes right into their body consciousness. And as I said, sometimes they'll literally hear it as a click, like something just clicked into place. Then they'll stand up. Sometimes I'll get people, to get up and just move around a little bit, and they just feel different. They feel different. And this is the process of really embodying our soul or our higher self, little by little, slowly but surely, and done over a period of time. So in this new era of not just awakening, but this new era of learning how to live our life authentically, learning how to bring every part of our life in alignment with our authentic self. This is the next piece of this era that is just now coming online, so to speak. And now we're starting to see people that are just, they're really attracted to this if they're ready. Obviously, everybody's got to be ready for whatever they're ready for. And when they are, then, the next teacher arrives, or the next program that's really right for them, supportive of them, to step into this process and really embrace it. Just manifests right before them.
Thank you for that, Dale. That's so insightful. And perhaps we have time for one more question that leads on to what you were talking about, which is, once you've identified one of these unpleasant truths and become determined or make the decision to actually work on it and focus on it, what is that real work that you described that helps to process through and ultimately let go and move beyond the nature of that unpleasant truth?
A great question. So whenever you're confronting an unpleasant truth, the unpleasant truth, now depending on how old it is, if it's been in there for months, it'll be one thing. If it's been in there for years or decades, it'll be a whole other thing. And what that means is that unpleasant truth is going to be hooked directly into some part of your life. It's going to be hooked directly into possibly a relationship or friendship, a partnership. It's going to be hooked directly into the way that you do business, in the way that you pursue your career, in the way that you are with your finances. It might even be hooked into a health issue that you're currently experiencing. this you can be assured, it's going to be hooked into something. And it's going to be hooked into something in your outer world of existing. And the reason why it's going to be hooked in there from a higher perspective is so that we can see it. That's one of the ways in how you identify an unpleasant truth. Now, with that being said, where the work comes into play, remember how we started here today around talking about that word change, right? Change is a very powerful word. It's also a very scary word because of what it implies. When I'm dealing with an unpleasant truth that's hooked into some part of my existence, and I begin to embrace whatever the change is that's going to come within that process of me confronting this, that will imply that I'm going to have to let someone or something go. But if it's someone that I've been hanging on to for the last 3 years, if it's something that I've been hanging on to for the last 3 years, no matter how I cut it, this is not going to be an easy process. And it most certainly is not going to be a quick process. It's going to be a process that's going to go on for maybe a few weeks, maybe even a few months. Again, depending on the depth of the unpleasant truth. And so around this, you're going to be constantly asked to change something. You're going to be constantly asked to let go of something or someone. Now, I say constantly because now your soul comes full on board with this, because needless to say, this is what the soul's been waiting for, is for us to make this discovery within inside of ourselves. So our soul is 100% in support of this. So the soul is like constantly there. Your soul can show up, for example, in your dream space, reminding you of this. It can create a dream. It can create a transformational dream. It can create a directional dream, pointing the way of what it is you're to be doing around whoever it is or whatever it is that you're to be letting go of. But this is where the work comes into play, because whatever or whoever it is that we're really to be letting go of, this is where now transformation comes in, right? So the transformation is, will we now step into our transformational experience of this idea of letting it go at whatever pace we can handle. You know, so I often say to people, little by little, slowly but surely, just find a progressive consistency, whatever it is that works for you and your nervous system. So, and now this is, in my view, this is a very important piece, because whatever it is you're letting go, whatever it is that you're in process of transforming, every bit of that has to run through the nervous system. And just like we see in the seminars, you know, as I mentioned, I've given thousands of seminars now, right? And my seminars are anywhere from a couple days long to literally 12 days in length. So some of them are very deep and really accelerated and very expansive. And I'm sure Jesse will tell you, even our 2-day seminars, people come into our 2-day classes and they feel they're pretty deep and they're very rich, but they're also designed to activate us in the healthiest of ways, to be able to make contact with this process of what you're ultimately going to enter into, where you're transforming this within your own consciousness. As you're transforming this, all of which is now being let go of has to run through the nervous system in order to be completely released. Well, like we see in the seminars. In the seminars, say we have, 60 people in the seminar. Of the 60 people, I'll just break them into 3/3. 1/3, their nervous system is not healthy. It moves very slow vibrationally. Moves very slow. The other third, it's a little more on the healthier side. It moves a little faster. What that means between those two groups, the nervous system that's moving very slowly, they have a difficult time pretty much processing anything. And quite frankly, they genuinely need to be in a seminar with the teacher that is most right for them. And I'll come back to that in a moment as to why that's so beneficial to them. That second group, their nervous system is vibing a little higher. It's a little healthier. What that means is that second group can actually take on more. They can really engage in their process and stay in their process, because as they unlock another piece into that unpleasant truth, that energy, in order to be let go of, in order to be successfully released, has to run through the nervous system. In other words, they have to feel it. They have to feel not just the feelings that come along, the emotions that come along or get activated, but in many cases, they also have to feel the sensations, which is different than the emotions. They feel that in their body. Well, what that is, all that are like streams of energy. So if you could see it, you would see it like units of energy or streamlines of energy striking, entering into the nervous system. Then the nervous system, as we process it, so the better we get at processing anything, quite frankly, the healthier our nervous system. In fact, those two go hand in hand. So when you're around somebody who's really skilled at processing, you can be assured they have a healthier nervous system. Someone who still is struggling with processing, who often gets snagged in their processing, gets snafu'd in their processing, their nervous system is just not as healthy, because those two go hand in hand. That third group, they usually are the ones who have been doing a lot more work. And it shows, because they're able to process more effectively and efficiently because their nervous systems are vibing at a higher level. Then you have, now it doesn't always happen this way, but if in fact the teacher of the seminar has the healthiest nervous system of everybody in the room, what that means is the teacher will lend his or her field of consciousness to everyone in the room. So now it doesn't matter what group you are in with the current rate of frequency that your nervous system is vibing at. What happens, everybody benefits, because there's another law that comes into play that says whenever you have two frequencies, one being a higher frequency, one being a lower frequency, whenever those two come together, it's an automatic given that the lower frequency will always rise to the higher frequency. It's never the higher frequency descends down to the lower frequency. It's the other way around. It's a universal principle. And so in a real powerful seminar setting that's designed not just by word, but by energy to really hold that healing space, what that means is at least one person in that room has a very high frequency in terms of their nervous system. In other words, they've done a lot of work. This is not something they've read out of a book. This is something that they've done through a lot of work, usually over a long period of time. And as a result, then people that come in the room with that person, they're now in that field. So now if we go to that first group, where the nervous system is just not that healthy at all, they benefit immensely from this. The first thing that happens for them, when they're in the presence of this type of person, they just naturally start to feel safer. Now, they're not aware of it. That's a real amazing piece, but they're not aware of it just yet. But they will say, I don't know what it is. I just like being here, and I can't wait for the next one. And they can't really articulate it. Well, that's what's happening. That's the very first benefit they draw from it, is that they just naturally start to feel safer. And when it comes to whatever it is that we're processing, everything is based on how safe we feel, for real now. So when I'm feeling super safe, if I've cleared out my safety issue, and that's now all been replaced with a healthy sense of safety, that allows me, it's one of the pillars of being able to process at the highest levels, is, that has already been achieved, if you will, within our field of consciousness. And so, I'll stop there unless there's another question, Jesse.
No, that's fantastic and very helpful. And I can say that I've personally experienced that in your seminars consistently and every time. I know that you call it the dome in terms of the energetic dome that is set up within those seminar settings. But I feel it as I come into the room, and certainly as the course of those seminars unfold. And I feel it afterwards as well, as I've shared with you, days after the seminar. It's a lasting shift. And it's interesting to come to understand that that is a result of, let's say, my energy rising up to be on par with or in line with the level of energy that you bring to the group and to the setting, and unlocking that, which is kind of magical in the sense that it happens naturally as a result of showing up and being in the presence, and also doing the work in the course of that seminar. So thank you for that. And I think that's a great opportunity to make a transition and begin to wrap this up. First, I want to thank you very much, Dale, for taking the time to share with everybody on the line and everybody that's listening to this on a replay. And everybody that registered for this presentation, you also saw a link to get the first few chapters of Being Called to Change, as well as some special audio bonuses that Dale has prepared. So please check that email and click that link to start reading Being Called to Change. And if you're being called to change in a greater way, feel free to pick up a full copy of the book wherever books are sold. Additionally, I'll make a mention now, and you'll see a follow-up email, that Dale's upcoming seminar in Las Vegas called Return to Wholeness takes place April 6th and 7th. So I'll be there. Dale, of course, will be there. And if you want to be there as well, I'll provide some follow-up information on how you can register. And I'll give Dale a chance to bring this to a close by sharing a little bit about that seminar and any closing thoughts.
Yes. Well, the seminar that's coming, Return to Wholeness, is exactly, that really is the theme of this particular class. And in light of what we've been talking about here today, it's, where we start the class is with a recognition around where we're at in our process of becoming whole again. In other words, what I'm strongly suggesting here is most people are not in their whole self just yet. And in fact, if they would let me help them put it to the test, it wouldn't take long at all for them to realize and recognize that they have not been operating from their whole self. What does that mean? They've been operating from, we'll say, half of their self, thinking it was their whole self. So, when it comes to manifesting a better life experience, when it comes to turning your life into a heavenly experience, when it comes to achieving something in your life that's really deeply and profoundly important to you, imagine, if you will, that if throughout your life you realized you were only operating with half of yourself, thinking it was all of yourself. And then you came to realize in the last part of your life, like, oh my gosh, I have a whole other part of me that exists that I have not been accessing. What would happen if you were actually able to access that other part of you and then begin to bring that other part of you in an integrative way into all that you are, so that you eventually come to this place where you return back to wholeness? And so this class is one of our classes in a series that we started last fall called Living Authentically. So we have, if you will, a brand under Living Authentically. Living Authentically has a handful of classes. Return to Wholeness is one of these classes. In this class, we start off that way, as I just suggested. But where we go is we go to a place where we begin to recognize how to actually walk this path, how to move on this path in a way that's conscious, responsible, and mature, to where one day in the not too distant future, you become whole again. Your wholeness is really your home place within inside of yourself. So when you feel like you are truly at home in your own body, this is you having done usually a fair amount of inner work. You've probably been guided by a few people along the way, as in teachers or mentors or coaches, to help you come to this place in time where you literally become whole again. So now what that implies is somewhere in this life, you broke away from your wholeness. We all did. And this is part of what we get into in this class, is that piece of where, or that time and period, or that time in our timeline where we broke away from our wholeness. And part of us went elsewhere on hold, and the other part of us stayed intact. And then at some point from that point on, we fell asleep. And we started to think, partly because of the influence of the ego, we start to think this is all we are. And that just simply is not the truth. It could very well be that we're only half of what we thought we already were. There's another half of us for us to either discover, or maybe we've discovered it, and maybe it's our time to really start to integrate it as we return back to this state of wholeness. So, this is really about finding our way back to our true self again. So again, under that greater teaching of learning how to live authentically, that when we're living authentically, this is one of the pieces, a significant piece that is, along our pathway to really bring our lives into full alignment with our own authenticity. And so another way to spot when you really have returned back home with inside yourself, not only do you feel at home in your own body, for real now, but there's something else that you'll notice. Once you've made your return back, you will no longer be at effect. You will no longer live your life at effect of others. Rather, you will now be living your life in a way to affect others. It's the most amazing, most beautiful, and totally divine thing to be able to come to this place where you start to see yourself in a whole new way, and eventually you begin to experience yourself in a whole new way where you're just no longer at effect on what's going on outside of you the way you used to be. That's when you were operating with, say, a half of a deck, only half of you. When you're operating with the whole of you, it's one of the gauges on your own dashboard of your own life that lets you know that you really have returned back to this state of wholeness, as in the whole you here in the physical.
Wonderful. Well, I am looking forward to that seminar all the more after hearing you share that. And just want to thank you again, Dale, for everything that you do to help pretty much everybody that you come in contact with, and especially for myself personally and for everybody that's on the line with us here today. So I want to also thank everybody that joined us live. I hope this has been a valuable and beneficial use of your Saturday morning or evening, depending on where you're calling in from the world. And for everybody that's listening to the replay, I hope this is equally valuable and transformational for you. So you'll get a follow-up email with another link to start reading Being Called to Change and access some free audio bonuses that Dale has put together. You're welcome to purchase a copy of Being Called to Change wherever books are sold. And I encourage you to join Dale and myself at Return to Wholeness, April 6th and 7th in Las Vegas. More information on that coming to you soon. So thank you once again, Dale. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll talk to you in the near future.
Thank you, Jesse. It's been a pleasure to be with you here today and everybody on the call.
Talk to you soon.